You say you want peace, but why does silence feel like weakness? Why does not defending yourself burn deeper than the insult itself? Maybe it's because we've been taught that strength means striking back, speaking up, proving our point. But here's the truth: most people can't stomach. Every time you react, you're giving someone else the remote control to your emotions. And that craving to be understood, that desperate need to explain yourself, it's not power. It's a quiet kind of slavery. The Stoics knew this. They didn't waste time debating fools. They mastered the one thing most people never do: their response. Because real power isn't loud, it's composed. It doesn't chase validation, it commands presence. So before you waste one more word on someone who doesn't deserve your energy, listen close. What you're about to hear will tear through your excuses and hand you something most people never find: complete control over your inner world. And if that kind of clarity means something to you, there's one simple way to keep it coming. Hit that subscribe button. Let's build something stronger together. You don't owe anyone a reaction. There's a certain kind of person who feeds on your reaction. Not your opinion, not your truth, your reaction. They throw a jab, a sideways comment, a passive-aggressive insult, not to start a dialogue, but to hijack your emotional state. And the moment you take the bait, the moment you let it get under your skin, they win something far more valuable than the argument. They win your energy, your attention, your control. That's the real cost. It's not about whether you were right, it's about whether you stayed rooted in your own frame. Marcus Aurelius said, "You always own the option of having no opinion." That's not apathy, it's discipline. It's knowing that you don't owe anyone access to your inner world. You can observe the chaos without absorbing it. You can hear the insult without becoming it. That's not weakness. That's power most people can't even comprehend. And let's be honest, most arguments aren't about truth. They're about ego, yours and theirs. They want to pull you into their storm so they don't have to sit in it alone. But if you've ever tried to reason with someone who just wants a fight, it's like wrestling with fog. No matter how sharp your logic, it won't land, because logic was never the goal. As Carl Jung put it, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. But only if we don't get lost in the noise. So, what if you stopped reacting? What if you let them talk, rant, provoke, and you stayed still? Not because you're shutting down, but because you're choosing your peace. Because you know the value of your presence, your calm, your clarity. Socrates once said, "Strong minds discuss ideas, average minds discuss events, weak minds discuss people." Most provocations are small talk for the weak-minded. Don't join the table. You don't need to respond to every comment, defend every opinion, or explain every choice. That's the trap. That's how you lose sight of your own power, by trying to validate it for someone else. Plato taught that the wise man speaks because he has something to say, not because he has to say something. And that silence, when held with intention, is one of the sharpest forms of speech there is. When you don't react, you make people confront themselves. That's why it's so uncomfortable for them. Because silence is a mirror. It reflects back their insecurity, their need for validation, their desperation to be seen. Aristotle believed that knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom, and once you truly know yourself, you stop handing out pieces of your peace just to prove you're solid. You already know you are. When you argue, you step into their arena. There's a line people cross when they pull you into their drama, and it's easy to miss. 1 second you're calm, clear, focused. The next, you're lured into a verbal tug-of-war that wasn't even your fight. And that's the trap, because the second you start arguing, you've already stepped off solid ground. You've entered their frame, their rhythm, their rules. Now you're reacting, now you're performing, now you're playing defense on a field they designed. The Stoics warned us, never let someone else dictate your response. Epictetus said, if someone succeeds in provoking you, realize that your mind is complicit in the provocation. That hits hard because it means the moment we engage, we're not just losing the argument, we're giving away our self-command. Not because we're wrong, but because we abandoned the one thing we were supposed to guard, our own frame. And look, people don't argue to learn, they argue to be right. Arguing rarely brings resolution. What it brings is pride, posturing, a deeper attachment to whatever false belief they're clinging to. As Carl Jung put it, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. That includes arguing with no intention of hearing you, because the moment it becomes about being right, truth has already left the room. Even Socrates, who built his legacy on asking questions, understood the danger of ego in conversation. His method wasn't about trapping people or proving superiority. It was about clarity, curiosity. But once ego enters the room, the conversation dies. Now it's a performance. And when you engage with performers, you become one too. And here's what they don't tell you. Winning an argument can still cost you. You may walk away with the last word, but what did it cost? Your peace? Your time? Your clarity? It's like walking through a swamp in fresh white clothes. You might make it across, but you won't look the same. Aristotle believed that the mark of an educated mind is to entertain a thought without accepting it. You can hear someone out without jumping into their emotional mess. You can listen, nod, observe, without engaging in the war they're itching to start. And that's what they fear most. Not your argument, your detachment. Because when you stay grounded while they escalate, you expose something they weren't ready to face. Their own imbalance, their own chaos, their own lack of control. And nothing is more uncomfortable than being faced with someone who refuses to be dragged down with you. The power of being unshakable. Some people walk into a room and shift the whole energy without saying a word. They don't beg for respect, they embody it. Not because they're trying to prove anything, but because they've mastered the one thing most can't, themselves. There's a kind of presence that doesn't need noise to be felt. It doesn't react, it doesn't flinch, and it never dances for attention. That's not arrogance, that's emotional discipline, and it's rare. The Stoics built their entire philosophy around this kind of inner stillness. Seneca said, "A gem cannot be polished without friction, nor a man perfected without trials." The point isn't to avoid the storm, it's to become so grounded that the storm moves through you without shaking your foundation. That's the real power. When others are panicking, explaining, overcompensating, you remain still, not frozen, just centered. Carl Jung once wrote, "The ability to ask a question is half the answer, and often silence is the most powerful question you can pose. When you don't react, you make people confront their own motives. You become a mirror they can't escape. And the truth is, most people aren't ready for that kind of reflection. They're not seeking understanding, they're seeking validation. So when you don't give them what they want, when you don't explain, defend, or justify, it unsettles them. That silence, it speaks louder than any argument ever could. Plato said, "The measure of a man is what he does with power," and one of the purest forms of power is restraint, the ability to feel the fire, but not throw fuel on it, to be provoked, but remain undisturbed. That's not passive, that's controlled force. It's choosing your battles so carefully that even your silence feels strategic. People often mistake calmness for weakness, but if you've ever watched someone stay composed while being insulted, while the room tests their limits, you know, that's not weakness. That's steel. That's maturity. That's someone who knows their worth is not determined by someone else's chaos. As Aristotle believed, it is the mark of an educated mind to be able to entertain a thought without accepting it. You don't have to let everything in. You don't have to let every jab penetrate your peace. Socrates lived by a simple principle: know thyself. And once you do, once you're no longer trying to prove your value to people who can't see it, you move differently. You stop rushing to explain. You stop reacting just because you were provoked. You stop playing small games for temporary applause. Instead, you move in silence. You listen more. You let others reveal themselves while you preserve your strength. Unshakable people aren't born that way. They become that way through practice, through patience, through pain. They've been through enough storms to know which ones are worth standing in and which ones aren't even worth opening the door for. And when you reach that level, your presence becomes louder than your voice ever could. People don't remember what you argued. They remember how you stayed calm when everything else was falling apart. Why silence hits harder than words. You ever notice how the person who says the least often holds the most sway? The one who doesn't rush to speak, doesn't overshare, doesn't jump into every debate. There's a tension in their stillness, a gravity. It's not just that they're quiet, it's that you can't read them. And in a world obsessed with transparency, mystery has become a form of dominance. The less you reveal, the more people project. The more they try to figure you out, the more they expose themselves. That's the hidden power of silence. It flips the dynamic completely. The Stoics knew this. They practiced silence not as a lack of opinion, but as a form of strength. As Marcus Aurelius said, you don't have to turn this into something. It doesn't have to upset you. He wasn't just talking about ignoring problems, he was pointing to the choice we always have. Engage or remain sovereign. And when you choose not to speak, not to argue, not to react, you choose control over chaos. You choose to protect your energy instead of handing it over for free. Carl Jung explored the idea of the shadow, the unconscious parts of ourselves that we repress or ignore, and one of those parts is the compulsive need to be understood. When someone provokes us and we respond, we're often not defending truth. We're defending our ego, our image, our desire to be seen in a certain way. But silence breaks that cycle. It forces us to sit with ourselves, and it forces others to sit with themselves too, often for the first time. Plato once said, "Wise men speak because they have something to say, fools because they have to say something." And that's the trap most people fall into. They fill the air to avoid discomfort. But silence creates discomfort. It sharpens attention. It makes people lean in, unsure of where you stand, uncertain of what you'll do next. And that uncertainty, that's power. Because while others are busy explaining themselves into corners, you're holding position, undisturbed and unreadable. When you argue, you're opening a door, you're showing your cards, you reveal what gets under your skin, where your limits are, how easily you're shaken. You hand over the map to your emotional terrain, and if the person in front of you knows how to navigate it, you've just given them the upper hand. Socrates mastered the art of asking instead of telling. His power wasn't in having the answers, it was in leading others to uncover their own. Silence does something similar. It doesn't force, it invites. It creates space. And in that space, people reveal more about themselves than they ever would in an argument. They show their fears, their ego, their hunger for reaction. And when you give them none of it, you rise above it all. Don't explain, execute. There's a subtle kind of strength that most people miss. It's not loud. It doesn't seek attention. It doesn't chase applause. It moves in silence, waits in stillness, and strikes with precision when the time is right. That's the difference between reacting and responding, between trying to prove yourself and simply proving it without the noise. Because the truth is, explaining too much is often just insecurity dressed up as logic. When you know who you are, you stop needing to narrate every move. The Stoics didn't speak for recognition. They acted in alignment with virtue, regardless of whether the world understood or approved. Seneca said, "Waste no time arguing what a good man should be one." It's that simple. Stop telling people who you are. Show them. Stop posting your intentions. Deliver the outcome. Let your discipline do the talking. Carl Jung warned that you are what you do, not what you say you'll do. That hits differently when you catch yourself over-explaining your plans, your dreams, your values to people who aren't even listening. Silence isn't avoidance, it's strategy. It's knowing that energy is currency, and not everyone deserves a transaction. Aristotle believed that excellence is not an act, but a habit. That means it doesn't need a spotlight. It doesn't need a microphone. It needs consistency, quiet, steady, unshakable execution. While others are busy rehearsing their explanations, trying to convince people of their worth, the disciplined are already building, already winning, already proving everything without having to say anything. Socrates taught by asking questions, not by demanding attention. He knew that transformation doesn't happen through force, it happens through clarity, and clarity doesn't need defense. If your values are clear, your mission sharp, your energy focused, then explaining yourself becomes a waste. The more solid you are internally, the less you need external validation. You don't need to explain why you cut someone off, why you stayed quiet in the meeting, why you didn't reply to that passive-aggressive message. You're not being rude, you're being intentional. You're conserving your fire for something that matters, because when you finally do move, when you deliver the result, the shift, the outcome, it lands like thunder. No warning, no build-up, just impact. What happens when you stay out of the mud? There's a certain kind of power that only shows up when you don't respond. Not because you didn't have something to say, but because you knew saying it would have cost more than it's worth. That's the kind of restraint most people can't understand, because they're still addicted to validation. They need to be seen, heard, right. But when you've outgrown that, when you're not looking for approval, the game changes. You stop fighting battles that lead nowhere. You stop stepping into the mud just to prove you don't belong there. Stoicism is rooted in this idea that we are responsible for our own minds, our own reactions, our own peace. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Choose not to be harmed, and you won't feel harmed. Don't feel harmed, and you haven't been." That mindset flips everything. It means their insult doesn't land unless you give it a place to land. Their chaos doesn't matter unless you invite it in. And when you don't, when you stay composed, still, grounded, it exposes them, not you. Think about the last time someone tried to get a rise out of you and you stayed silent. Remember how they stumbled after? How they started backtracking, explaining themselves, even getting louder, trying to get something, anything, out of you. That's because silence is uncomfortable for them. When you don't react, people have to sit in the space they created, and most can't handle their own energy without a response to bounce it off. Plato said, "Wise men speak because they have something to say, fools because they have to say something." In those moments when tension fills the air and everyone's waiting for a reaction, silence becomes a statement. A loud one, not passive, powerful, because it tells the room everything it needs to know. You're not here to play small games. You're not here to prove yourself. You've already won by staying centered. Socrates believed in questioning the world, not reacting to it. He taught that knowledge begins with acknowledging what you don't know, not proving what you do. And sometimes not responding isn't just maturity, it's wisdom. It's knowing that most attacks don't need answers. They need distance. They need space to burn themselves out. So when you stay out of the mud, when you don't jump into the petty back and forth, when you don't let someone's bitterness stain your calm, you don't just avoid the mess, you redefine the tone of the room. You show everyone what real control looks like. You walk away not as someone who backed down, but someone who never needed to step down in the first place. Control isn't about dominating, it's about not getting dragged. You can spot it a mile away, the person who can't let it go. Their voice sharpens, their hands start moving, their whole body leans into the tension like they need to win just to breathe again, and you can feel it. They're no longer trying to communicate, they're trying to survive something inside themselves. That's not control, that's the ego on fire, and it burns fast. Real control doesn't flex. It doesn't need to overpower or outtalk. It doesn't care about being right in the moment. It's thinking 5 moves ahead. The Stoics understood this deeply. Epictetus said, "Anyone capable of angering you becomes your master." That's not just about anger. It's about giving away your clarity, your direction, your frame. Control is the refusal to hand your emotional state over to someone who didn't earn it. Carl Jung would say, "Where wisdom reigns, there is no conflict between thinking and feeling." That's the internal battle most people lose. They feel something rising, shame, pride, fear, and instead of observing it, they act on it, react on it, try to control the outside world because they've lost grip on their inner one. But once you see that clearly, once you feel how quickly pride hijacks logic, you learn to pause. And that pause, that's where real power lives. Plato taught that self-control was the foundation of justice, of inner harmony. It's the discipline to stay calm when others stir the storm. Not because you're passive, but because you've stopped letting noise dictate your next move. You choose stillness over spectacle. You respond with presence instead of panic. You don't have to dominate every conversation. You don't need to correct every lie or prove every point. When you try to control others, you lose yourself. But when you control yourself, everything around you starts to bend differently. The tone shifts, the pressure breaks. People start adjusting to you, not the other way around. And Socrates, he mastered this. He didn't force people to agree with him. He just kept asking questions, calmly, with precision, letting their own inconsistencies unravel the illusion. That's control, not by force, but by presence, by being so grounded in your truth that you never need to shove it in anyone's face. So here's the shift. Control isn't about being untouchable. It's about being unmoved. Not because you're numb, but because you've trained yourself to recognize what's actually worth your energy. And most arguments, most ego battles, they aren't. When you stop needing to respond, you gain something that can't be faked. Authority. And not the kind that demands attention, the kind that earns quiet respect, the kind that shifts rooms with stillness, not volume. That's the kind of control that never has to announce itself, because it already owns the space. Refusing to argue protects your energy. Some fires die out on their own if you just stop pouring your energy into them, but most people can't help themselves. They see smoke and think it's their job to put it out, to jump in, fix it, explain themselves, correct the record, and by the time they're done, they've drained hours, burned through their peace, and walked away with nothing but tension in their chest. Not because the argument mattered, but because they thought it did. The Stoics taught us to protect our inner fortress. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." That includes the power to say, "I don't need to engage. I don't need to make you see my side. I don't need to step into every storm someone tries to hand me. Not everything that calls for your attention deserves it. Carl Jung believed that much of our suffering comes from the refusal to accept our limits, and one of the hardest things to accept, that not everyone will understand you, not everyone deserves your time, not everyone should get a seat at your emotional table. And the second you realize that, you start to conserve something incredibly rare in today's world: your energy. Aristotle said that the energy of the mind is the essence of life. So how much of your life are you leaking by chasing arguments that don't serve you? How much power are you giving away just to defend a point to someone who's already decided they're not listening? You're not weak for walking away. You're not soft for choosing silence. You're wise for not turning every disagreement into a war. Plato spoke of balance, how the soul must remain in harmony to function fully. And arguing, constantly defending yourself, chasing approval, that throws everything out of tune. You can stand strong without standing loud. You can hold your boundaries without raising your voice. You can let someone misunderstand you and still keep your peace intact. That's not avoidance. That's mastery. That's the kind of discipline that can't be taught in words, only lived in action. Watch how people react to your stillness. Some people aren't looking for resolution. They're looking for reaction. They poke, prod, provoke, not to solve anything, but to pull you out of your center. And when you don't take the bait, when you stay still, calm, unmoved, you flip the script entirely. That silence you hold, it becomes a weight they weren't prepared to carry. The Stoics didn't chase conflict. They trained for clarity. Epictetus said, "It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters." That pause you take, the breath instead of the backlash, that's where power lives. Not in raising your voice, but in refusing to hand over your peace just because someone else dropped theirs. Carl Jung understood this deeply. He said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. But only if you don't get pulled into their chaos. Only if you hold the mirror up and watch. Because when you stay silent, people don't know where to aim. They start projecting, revealing, unraveling. Not because you attacked, but because you didn't." Aristotle spoke of moderation, the golden mean, not too much, not too little. Stillness is exactly that. Not absence, not apathy. Just a balanced response in a world addicted to overreaction. When you withhold what they expect, anger, defensiveness, validation, you force them to deal with themselves. And for most, that's far more uncomfortable than anything you could have said. Socrates believed that the unexamined life is not worth living. Stillness gives people that rare, uncomfortable gift, space to examine. And they won't thank you for it, but they will remember it. Because silence sticks. It lingers. It creates an echo they have to sit with. The quiet ones control the room. Some people walk in and instantly take up space, without raising their voice, without announcing themselves. They don't dominate through volume, they lead through presence. And that presence, it's not random. It's built through discipline, restraint, and choosing when to speak, and more importantly, when not to. Because once you realize that every word has weight, you stop wasting them on noise. The Stoics lived by this. Seneca wrote, "Speech is the mirror of the mind." So what are you reflecting when you talk just to fill silence? When you answer questions no one asked, or defend choices no one challenged? The quiet ones, the ones who only speak when it matters, they're not being mysterious, they're being precise. They know their voice hits harder when it's not constantly echoing in the background. Carl Jung said, "Solitude is for me a fount of healing which makes my life worth living." That solitude, that space between thoughts and responses, that's where clarity sharpens, and people feel it. They don't just hear what you say, they sense the intention behind it, the restraint, the control. That's what shifts a room without saying much at all. Aristotle believed that the wise man speaks not because he must, but because he has something to say. In every interaction, there's a decision. Am I speaking from impulse or from awareness? The quiet ones have trained that awareness. They've learned to sit with their thoughts instead of spilling them, to listen longer, to move second, and strike first. Socrates made his impact through questions, not monologues. His brilliance wasn't in saying more, it was in guiding others to say less and mean more. And that's the paradox most people miss. The fewer words you use, the more powerful they become. When you're not constantly explaining, defending, or reacting, your words start to carry a different kind of weight. It's not about being cold, it's about being clear. There comes a point where you stop explaining your piece. Not because you're better than anyone, but because you've learned the cost of chaos. And it's not worth it. You're not being cold when you choose space. You're being clear. Clear about your energy. Clear about your boundaries. Clear about what you're no longer willing to tolerate, just to make someone else comfortable. The Stoics weren't emotional shut-ins. They were masters of internal order. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself daily, the tranquility that comes when you stop caring what they say or think or do. Only what you do. That's not disconnection, that's alignment. You're not avoiding people, you're avoiding unnecessary noise, drama, projections. People who don't ask how you're doing, they just assume. And when you don't play along, they call it distant. Carl Jung noted, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But that process, it gets quieter, cleaner, sharper. And as you get more centered, the expectations from others start to feel heavier. The need to reply, to explain, to prove, it falls off. Because clarity doesn't chase understanding, it simply stands. When someone says you're acting different, maybe that's true. Maybe you've outgrown conversations that loop in circles. Maybe your silence isn't withdrawal, it's a filter. You're not here to fix what you didn't break. You're here to move forward with intention. Plato said the soul thrives when it turns inward, and that kind of self-awareness doesn't always look social. Let them say you're cold. Let them misunderstand your stillness. That's not your burden. You're not here to audition for approval. You're here to live in alignment with your values, your focus, your peace. And if someone can't sit with you in that clarity, then maybe they were only drawn to your confusion. You don't need to burn bridges. You just need to stop building ones that lead back into dysfunction. Not everyone will understand the version of you that no longer explains itself, and that's fine. The people meant to walk with you won't need an explanation. They'll recognize your silence as strength, your distance as discipline, and your clarity as the language of someone who finally stopped leaking energy into places it was never respected. Turn down the volume, turn up your power. The world's a constant buzz, opinions flying, egos clashing, everyone trying to outshout each other. It's exhausting. But if you watch closely, the ones who hold real influence aren't in the noise. They're the ones who move quietly, speak rarely, and still shift the entire room. Not by force, not by volume, but by presence. By being so deeply rooted in who they are that the chaos around them never shakes their frame. The Stoics lived by that stillness. Epictetus said, "First say to yourself what you would be, and then do what you have to do." That kind of clarity doesn't demand attention, it attracts it. When your energy is directed inward, when your focus is locked on what matters, you stop reacting to everything that doesn't. You stop entertaining distractions, and you stop explaining your silence. Carl Jung believed that the more we externalize our focus, trying to please, trying to impress, the more fragmented we become. The true self disappears under the noise, but when we center ourselves, when we move with calm, deliberate intent, we stop being pulled in every direction, and that's when people start to notice. Not because you're loud, but because your stillness speaks louder than their chaos ever could. You don't need to respond to every challenge. You don't have to defend your path to people who've never walked it. Plato once wrote, "The wise man will want to be ever with him who is better than himself." But wisdom doesn't scream for recognition. It simply is. And the more you embody that, the more others either rise to meet you or quietly fall away. True power is subtle. It doesn't need to convince. It doesn't seek a spotlight. It just exists with such solid intent that everything around it has no choice but to adjust. That's leadership. That's strength. Not in how much noise you make, but in how little you need to. The most powerful response is no response. There's a certain kind of strength that doesn't announce itself. It just refuses to flinch. It doesn't chase approval, doesn't argue for validation, doesn't need to be right in a room full of wrong. That kind of strength sits quietly, unmoved, while others throw words like punches. And when you don't swing back, when you don't react, don't explain, don't engage, that silence hits harder than anything you could have said. The Stoics understood this deeply. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself, "The best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injury." That means you don't become reactive just because someone else is. You don't match their tone, you don't mirror their chaos. You stay still, not because you're avoiding conflict, but because you've mastered the art of not handing your energy to people who never earned it. Carl Jung talked about individuation, the process of becoming whole, and part of that process? It's recognizing when your reaction is about the moment and when it's about an unresolved need to be seen. Once you realize you don't owe that explanation, not to everyone, not all the time, you start to conserve something most people spend without thought: your peace. Silence isn't emptiness, it's control, it's presence. It's the ability to sit in tension without needing to fix it. Aristotle believed that virtue lies in the balance, not in excess, not in deficiency. Silence, when chosen consciously, is that balance. Not too much, not too little. Just enough to shift the energy without a word. You don't need to tell people you're unbothered. You show them by not biting the hook. You show them by keeping your focus sharp and your reactions scarce. The moment you choose peace over proving a point, you win something much bigger than the argument. You win the room, not through dominance but through composure. And people feel it. That stillness, that control. They start to adjust. Not because you asked, but because your energy gave them no other option. That's not avoidance. That's authority. That's what happens when you let your silence speak for you and say everything that noise never could. Sometimes the loudest thing you can say is nothing at all. In a world addicted to reaction, your calm is rebellion, your stillness is strength, and your silence. That's the kind of clarity that doesn't beg to be heard. It commands respect without saying a word.